Before the term white was used as a tool of power and privilege in colonial Virginia, it had an entirely different meaning in Moorish societies. In this episode of Moorish History TV, we trace the ancient origins and complex applications of the word white, long before it was weaponized in Anglo-American racial systems. Dr. Richard Smith, who earned his doctorate in historical theology in 1996 and served with the International Institute for Christian Studies, published a landmark paper titled, "What Happened to the Ancient Libyans?" Smith warns us not to project modern racial categories onto ancient peoples. He cites Greco-Roman sources like Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder, who describe two groups in North Africa: the Leuk-Aethiopes, meaning white Ethiopians, and the Melano-Gaetulians, or black Gaetulians. These terms were geographical and complex. Ethiopian meant black-skinned, but Leuk-Aethiopes were described as white black men, people lighter in complexion but still identified as having black skin. Edmund Dean Morel, in his 1902 book Affairs of West Africa, builds on this. He notes that Ptolemy placed the Leuk-Aethiopes near the Gambia and Pliny slightly north. Morel suggests they were early Fulani, citing a 1799 connection made by Major Rennell in his writings on Mungo Park. The Fulani Empire, he notes, had rulers with names containing Fulfulde affixes, and these rulers were described as white, not in the European sense, but in a socio-cultural and spiritual one. Professor Elizabeth Isiche, in A History of African Societies to 1870, describes how the Marca people on the Niger Bend identified themselves as white. But this too was symbolic. It denoted their Islamic faith and social status. The term white was often applied to groups distinguished by cultural traits or lighter skin tones, not by European racial definitions. Dr. Dana Reynolds Marniche, editor and research consultant at Mount Meru, Inc., highlights the complexity of terms like white in African manuscripts. In her analysis of Thaddeus Lewicki and early Arabic texts, she notes that groups like the Bafur Zenata Berbers and even the Soninke merchants were described as whites, again referencing social class, spiritual lineage, or relative complexion. Dr. Rebecca Fudo Kennedy, a classical scholar, explains that white in the ancient world was a label used in a very different way, sometimes for people from the cold north, sometimes for those with disease, and even in Roman poetry, as a political party. In one Roman poem, the whites and the blacks weren't races. They were factions like modern political parties or sports teams. Whiteness wasn't a racial identity. It was symbolic, political, temporary, not a social caste defined by skin color. Be sure to check out her interview Herodotus on Ancient Africa, There Is No Sub-Saharan. When Dr. Arakana Kennedy said white was a political term in ancient Egypt, she wasn't just being provocative. She was exposing a historical truth that's been buried under centuries of colonial propaganda. Herodotus, the Greek father of history, described Egyptians plainly. He said they had black skin and woolly hair. Aristotle, another Greek philosopher, called Egyptians too black. These weren't modern racial terms, they were ancient observations. Why does this matter to black Americans today? Because the so-called white Fulani were enslaved in the United States. Prince Among Slaves, a documentary by Andrea Kalin, tells the story of Abdul Rahman Ibn Sori, a Fulani prince who was captured and enslaved in Mississippi. Another example is Yaro Mahmoud, a Fulani man who won his freedom and lived in Washington, D.C. These were Moors, intellectuals, traders, rulers, reduced by the Atlantic slave system. Even Ignatius Donnelly in Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, notes that the Fulani ruling class in Messina were lighter-skinned and claimed descent from ancient white ancestors, not Europeans, but white as defined in their own African cultural terms. The use of white in ancient Africa and among the Moors was never about supremacy or exclusion. It was about faith, social order, complexion, and context. Only in the Anglo-colonial world did it become a weapon. As Theodore W. Allen reminds us, white race is the Achilles heel of the labor, democratic, and socialist movements in this country. Fast forward to the colonial period and we see the rise of an entirely new construct, the political invention of the white race. Theodore W. Allen, in The Invention of the White Race, lays bare the origins of racial privilege. He writes, "The white race is not part of genetic evolution but a ruling class social control formation. Created by the Anglo-American bourgeoisie in the late 1600s, this system served to divide labor, reinforce oppression, and guarantee ruling class domination." Dr. Jacqueline Batalora, in Birth of a White Nation, echoes this. She explains that for nearly a century after the Virginia colony was founded, no settlers were called white. That term only entered American legal and cultural usage around 1681. It did not arrive with the common law of England. Her message is clear. White people did not exist before 1681, not as a race, but as a socio-political tool. Understanding how white was used before 1681 helps us reclaim our narratives and resist the lies built into racial hierarchies. If you enjoyed this video, type #whitewash in the chat. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe.